Hey chefs and supply chain professionals, did you know that the Beef Checkoff's Northeast Beef Promotion Initiative serves the food service and beef community in over 7 states and 72 million consumers within the Northeast region? Through culinary school grants and immersive educational experiences focusing on animal welfare, sustainability, and production practices and improvements, we are your resource for all things beef. You play a vital role in the supply chain with craveable dishes and innovative events, and we can help you market and promote beef to enhance your bottom line. We are passionate about the beef industry and devoted to connecting the dots from farm to fork. Visit nebpi.org to learn more and access all of our beef resources today.
Welcome to ACF Chefs Forum. We appreciate you joining us today as we learn more about the state of the consumer. Now, more than ever, and especially during this difficult time, it's important for culinarians to connect, to share, and to offer inspiration and mentorship, which is exactly why we're excited to have industry experts here today with us, just for you, the leaders of the food service industry. Before we begin, as a note, we will be taking questions at the end from you, the viewers. Please use the chat function to collaborate with other viewers and the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen to pose questions to our guest speakers. Let's get the discussion going in the chat. Tell us where you're tuning in from today. I'm Jackie Pressinger, American Culinary Federation's Director of Strategic Partnerships, and I am so pleased to introduce our special guests. The year 2020 has been transformative. Its impact will be felt for years to come. We are excited to welcome Sean Darcy, Senior Director of Market Research for the National Cattlemen and Beef Association, Brooke Patton, Associate Director of Market Research for National Cattlemen's Beef Association, and also on the line is Caitlin Swope, Director of Consumer Affairs for Northeast Beef Promotion Initiative. Thank you all for joining us today, and at this time, I'll pass the presentation over to you.
Thank you, Jackie. My name's Sean Darcy, and my colleague Brooke Patton and I plan to go through a report on the current state of the consumer and just talk about how transformative a year it has been. I think that's a great word that we can use as we get into all of this. So one of the things, this is based off of a report we had put together back in November and December of last year, and you can find that on beefresearch.org under the market research page. That link will be put into the chat as well as we go through here. And just as a quick reminder, we're happy to take questions. We'll do our best if we see something throughout the presentation, but we'll be sure to leave time in that Q&A to answer any of that Q&A that comes into that Q&A function for that screen. So of course, we have to reflect a little bit on 2020. As rough of a year and transformative of a year as it might have been, we want to just share some data that sets up the mind of the consumer. A lot of this you probably have heard, just putting some numbers behind it. Then I'll pass it over to my colleague Brooke, and she'll go over the next few sections on just how an online behavior shifted during this time, what we saw in the food supply, and a little bit on the outlook and where we see some opportunity areas. And then I'll take it back over and discuss some of our market research on beef production, and we're in the midst right now of actually doing a lot of work on sustainability. We have a few high-level findings, and in another month or two, we'll be rolling out some more of those findings as well that we have here at NCBA. So jumping right into it, right? It's not a surprise. About this time last year, maybe a little bit before, we started seeing the shock of COVID and the impact that it had, whether it was the virus itself, stay-at-home orders. We're starting to see those getting lifted a little bit. We're starting to see comfort levels. Even for a while, the economy itself, with the stock markets going down, now a lot of that has recovered itself, but people losing jobs and so on. One of the big things we saw, this was actually taken at my local grocery store, is shelves were empty. You see the meat case, and the only thing there is meat substitutes that was left there. But that was a dynamic that we're seeing. And Brooke's going to talk about some of those supply issues. But for a time there, we were 30 to 90% higher year over year, which is just a shock. Typically 1 to 2% higher year over year would be a great year for any meat commodity, whether that's beef, chicken, pork. So to be with those numbers is pretty astronomical. So for a time there, we did see some empty shelves. The retailers did a great job adjusting. We even had some limited capacity there for a little while, but we were able to recover and have a great year for beef. This slide just shows you concern with actual COVID and how that's tracked. And really what it's showing you, and this is through most of last year, is there were times that get a little higher and lower, but for the most part, people still had a concern about COVID-19 in general. You know, some of our data through this year is some of that is easing a little bit, but it is still there. And there's a lot on consumer minds. You know, we've just talked about a lot of it, but job security is one. Obviously, the unemployment rate for the first time since the 1980s was above double digits for more than 1 month at a time. So for back-to-back months, which we had there for about 3 or 4 months in a row when COVID-19 first happened. Now that has also gotten better, but we're still well above the numbers that we've seen in the last few years. Obviously, there's just general concerns, whether it was the political environment that we had last year with an election year, all of the social ideas that are going on, you know, kids going to learn. You know, I have 2 children of my own. Sometimes they're virtual, sometimes they're in school. And now we're starting to take surveys for next year. What's that going to look like? So there's just a lot on consumers' minds. And believe it or not, it does translate a little bit on how they're making food decisions, what's impacting food, and so on. This slide right here shows you the comfort level that people have, and this was as of December of last year, on just performing these activities like shopping inside at a store, eating outside at a restaurant, eating inside at a restaurant, which you see about 27% of people were comfortable doing as of December, all the way through like doing things like attending church, going to a bar, attending an indoor sporting event. And the net takeaway, even as the vaccine was starting to become available during this time, people were still a little hesitant for that comfort level. Some of that might be restrictions, other of it's just the comfort level in general and starting to do these things. We do know consumers are eager to get back out and do them. You're looking over on the right, you see people want to get back to going out to eat, with 60% of people wanting to go to some of these events, wanting to travel. That's a big one. I think people have been stuck at home for a while. So you're going to be seeing a lot of these type of things happening. It's just going to take some time to get acclimated. Another question that we ask on top of that comfort level was, how are you going to feel once the vaccine was available? You know, again, this is as of December. You do see an increase in the comfort level once people were vaccinated or were going to get vaccinated on doing these things, but not one of these things is above the majority of the population. You know, we actually have some data that's going on that in regards to this that's updated in April, and what we're seeing is that level of comfort has started to creep up and increase now that more of the country has been vaccinated. And once again, different areas have started lifting some of those restrictions in different areas of the country. So we are starting to see that, but still there is a good chunk of people, I would say about 40%, that are still not comfortable doing most of these activities. And they indicated it'll take at least 3, if not 6 months for them to start feeling comfortable doing so. So that just lets you know where some of those activities are at. So with that, I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Brooke Patton. She can introduce herself a little bit and just dive right into the data.
Great. Thanks, Sean. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to start by sharing information from one area you probably all know has been largely impacted from COVID-19, but that we continue to see trends in, and that is online activity. So video streaming is, of course, one factor of online activity, but where we saw some significant increases, and which, again, none of us would find as a huge surprise, but this chart might be a bit difficult to interpret, but the different colors here reflect different ages, and the total size of the bars represent the total streaming time. So what we're seeing is that the average weekly streaming in minutes shown at the end is increasing. So total time spent for video streaming is up, and especially among those aged 55 or older are taking up more of that share. So really what we see is the adoption of online behavior start to impact those who are maybe slower to adopt in the beginning. This also translates to the time spent on apps and web. Of course, with increased online activity, we'd see this to go up as well. This shows the total hours spent on average from 2018 all the way through to that top bar at 2020. And you can see the time spent on smartphones in particular is up 45 minutes on average from 2019. Now, how does this translate to food and beef? Consumers are also learning to fend for themselves during COVID-19 and the pandemic, and even through now, they're continuing to cook more at home, but especially as they were first stuck at home with shutdowns, we saw search behavior for things like how can I make, as well as what can I make with, as they were trying to make do with cooking at home more and possibly, shortages of products and trying to work with whatever they might have had in their fridge or freezer. Apologies here. So all of these examples are to signify just how drastic the consumer landscape has changed and how far-reaching the impact has been. Even our own Beef It's What's for Dinner website, we saw the impact from shifting online behavior, which you can see some examples here taken from our actual online landing pages. You can see the visits in the month are up across the board, but even more specific searches like oven roasting time and beef cuts and gravy showing up here, as this data was taken kind of during that fall timeframe when consumers were likely getting ready to cook some of their favorite recipes. With all of the changes of COVID, we also wanted to share with you kind of how NCBA, on behalf of the Beef Checkoff, where we were focused on, and the two areas in the heightened stages of COVID-19 this spring. First, we wanted to be able to help answer some tough questions from consumers with regards to COVID-19, and particularly the frequently asked questions driven by the industry shortages and supply chain issues. But second was also how we could be a resource to those consumers who are cooking at home and providing that opportunity for them to choose beef and cook delicious beef recipes. Now, to get more specific and take a look at the impact that the pandemic has had on the food supply going into 2021 even, as mentioned, the majority of consumers were eating their meals at home. In fact, around 84% of total consumer meals were being cooked at home. And we'd expect this to continue into 2021 to some extent, but probably not as large of a majority as we saw previously. And what this meant is that overall, there really was a big shift from food service into retail. So consumers were shopping at retail and stocking up on protein a lot more. For context, in 2019, year-over-year dollar sales were higher, while poundage was lower compared to 2019. This drastically changed in 2020. With increased consumer transactions in retail, as we'd expect, and which we'll cover on the next slide, we saw 2020 numbers below 2019 retail numbers out of the water. So here you can see kind of just how drastic that was. In 2019, retail growth in dollars was about 1.9 billion. 2020, it doubled to 2.9 billion. And 2021 continues to see this trend. This increased demand in the retail level is shown by the year-over-year monthly increases here. And for context, beef led the way in increased sales in terms of dollars, beating chicken and pork in every month since February, which is great to see. In the beginning of the summer, supply chain disruptions, however, were experienced, so temporarily leading to some empty or sparsely supplied meat cases, as many of us probably saw. And this supply chain shortage, combined with increased consumer demand, led to an increase in pricing for most proteins. Now that things have leveled off and we look into March 2021, we see things kind of taking a more level approach with dollar sales at 19% for March. As demand at retail grew and with the supply chain issues, in keeping up with that, price inflation, of course, resulted in 9.63 billion added total dollars for 2020, with beef accounting for nearly 6 billion of that, which speaks to the strong year that beef has even had throughout 2020. But unfortunately, as you're all aware, COVID has had devastating impacts on food service. And we recognize it's been tough, especially for food service restaurants, suffering more so than quick service restaurants. And at its worst, transactions were actually 80% lower year over year compared to 2019 for 2020. But there is light at the end of the tunnel. Since the beginning of April, you can see here the market has seen a steady improvement, and we most likely will see a lot of volatility in these markets, as we continue to see positivity rates work towards stabilizing, but there is a promise that things will return to normal soon. And this impact on food service has obviously created a trade-off with retail, as we're kind of covering both markets here. Normally, the food service industry comprises roughly 60% of all fresh beef demand consumed in the US, but COVID led to restrictions on the operations and capacity of restaurants and other food service establishments, as we're all aware. So that actually pushed roughly 7% of annual food service demand into retail channel, as you can see that shift for 2020. So as mentioned, there is light at the end of the tunnel. So looking forward to 2021, there are some behaviors that we expect to stick around and actually benefit, hopefully, the retail and food service industries. But to start, I want to give kind of a basis for what consumption looked like during this time. So even though there has been a lot of negative consequences as a result of COVID-19, one positive thing we do see is a strong beef demand and beef consumption. Here you can see the total percentage of consumers reporting that they eat these proteins on a weekly basis. This is taken from ongoing research that we are running just to keep an eye on things throughout the entire year and moving forward into 2021. But you can see compared to 2019 averages, the overall number of consumers who were reporting that they were eating beef on a weekly basis was quite a bit higher. And while meat alternative consumptions and even chicken has increased as well, it's quite a bit lower than what we see for animal proteins. This also translates to willingness to pay. So as mentioned, we saw food shortages and supply chain challenges causing price inflations. And fortunately, consumers adjusted their willingness to pay to kind of meet those price points. So you can see over time, the willingness to pay for ground beef, steak, and even chicken has drastically increased. And what's even interesting is we continue to see these higher levels over previous year averages maintain, especially for steak. Now, as we start to paint a more positive picture of what we can look forward to for the next year, e-commerce is probably the first thing that comes to mind and provides the greatest opportunity to turn things around, particularly as it relates to food. You can see here, this is taken from some research we conducted back in April of 2020. The total number of consumers who are engaging in online grocery and meal ordering were pretty significant, with the majority of them, and with many consumers who actually increased or just started this behavior. What's great to see is that consumers who were partaking in online meal ordering or grocery ordering were very satisfied with their experience. This specifically referencing their beef ordering experience satisfaction, knowing that fresh foods, fresh meats can often encounter more negative sentiment. We only had 5% who actually reported that they had a negative. It's not just among those who've maybe tried it before. As mentioned, those who've never gotten their groceries or meals online now are kind of forced to find a solution, as either their grocery stores were out of stock for many items or they weren't safe enough to go to. And once again, this is just showing how much search terms for things like food delivery or pickup increased after the pandemic hit. And we know, because they increased so much, that it's likely driven by some portion of consumers who had never done this activity before, and ideally are likely to continue this behavior. So for the future, what this means is that the space was already poised for growth before, but now we just see that to grow at an even higher rate. So when you see the sales growth jump from 3.4% in 2019 to 10.2% in 2020 here, which we weren't expected to get to that point until 2024, but what that purple line is showing is the expected growth prior to COVID, and as a result of it, the blue line is really now well above our previous projections and where we're expected to be as a result now. And you might be wondering who is driving e-commerce space in terms of food based on its growth. Well, for now, it's driven by brick and mortar stores with click and pickup. Obviously, there is that delivery option, but many are still opting for the convenience of being able to pick it up. But e-commerce sites like Instacart are certainly relevant in growing. And then in terms of share are the e-commerce only sites like Amazon Fresh. And you'll be happy to see the same situation with online meal ordering. Here, their percentage share of ordering done digitally increased by 11% in 2020 through July, August, and September compared to 2019. And this increase in online ordering grew for both digital carryout and delivery. In fact, in Q4 of 2020, digital meal ordering was nearly 800 million transactions higher for digital pickup. and over 500 million for digital delivery. So as we are in 2021, this means you can expect consumers to start dining out, but also continue this newer increased behavior of meal ordering as well, as it's starting to be adopted into their daily or weekly meal routines. And really combined with restaurants opening back up would bring food service industry back to normal levels. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Sean to get into kind of a more specific and trending topic of sustainability as it relates to consumers and what we're doing.
Thanks, Brooke. All right, so just to recap that a little bit, I think the thing about the online grocery and online meal ordering is, I think they're definitely here to stay in some capacity when we see the data and look at secondary resources. The meal ordering, I do think is an interesting dynamic. When we look at the data, I think it's definitely a growth area and will continue to be because restaurants have done a great job adapting as well as third-party sites. But wondering, I think it'll be interesting to see what that is once we do open up a little bit more and consumers are more comfortable, because there is that eagerness to get back out and not have to cook every meal at home and actually get out of the house a little bit as well. So it'll probably be somewhere in the middle of where it currently sits in some capacity. So I'm going to kind of take a bit of a 180 and start talking about beef production and sustainability and what we've seen both in our tracking data at a high level compared to some of our other things like taste and value, but then also digging into the topics a little bit on what we're currently seeing. So what you're seeing here is a lot of data, but you're seeing data back to 2018 from our consumer beef tracker on some of our top things that people consider when they are making a meal choice at home. The same dynamic can be true away from home as well, that you're going to be seeing here. Great tasting, is a good value for money, convenience, safety. Those are your top drivers for consumers when they're making a meal choice. And then you see this secondary driver of nutrition here on the right sneak up. And most of these have maintained that level since 2018. Now, if we jump over to more production related ideas like food not having antibiotics, raised responsibly, environment, supports causes that are important to me, and so on, you are seeing more consumers considering these things since 2018. Now, if you go back one slide, these numbers are not nearly what you're seeing here in the high 70s, even high 80s when you're talking about the taste of a meal. But we are starting to see consumers consider these things. Now, coming to the point of purchase, we know not every consumer converts there. We also know not every consumer is coming from a negative stance when they're thinking about these in beef, but we do know it is top of mind and something here at NCBA on behalf of the Beef Checkoff that we're always thinking about when we are looking to promote and think about beef production. So we've been trending things. This question specifically is thinking about how cattle are raised for food. How positive or negative are you? And in a typical year, if you go over to this gray part of the line here, you see about 38% of consumers said that they were positive about how beef is raised. Now, that doesn't mean everyone else is negative. We actually have a big chunk in the middle that either don't have an opinion or are neutral on the topic, but we have seen that number grow throughout the entirety of 2020. And believe it or not, before 2020, we only had 1 year where this was above 40%. Every month was above 40% in 2020. It kind of goes, there was so much on consumer minds. The theory is maybe just at least temporarily, they weren't thinking about animal agriculture as negatively as they typically do with so many other things going on in the world. Now, that is probably temporary, but we have seen this nice uptick in the way people feel. The other thing to note on that is there was those supply issues back in spring. So it could be at least for a little bit that we're getting a little bit of a bump with people realizing more the process that it takes to get food into the grocery stores, to have it at the restaurants and so on. So another question we ask is an open-ended question just to see what concerns, if anything, that people have about animal welfare. So we ask, thinking about how animals are raised, what, if anything, are you concerned about? Looking at the left, you see about on a typical year, 63% of people have a concern. This year, that's gone down by 5% at 58% of people saying they have a concern. Again, getting that theory that they're not as concerned. But really the focus, and then we've seen this for years now, is on animal welfare. How are those animals treated? How does that impact the meat? But knowing that they want the animals to be treated well. Not one of these other topics has about 10% of people mentioning it when we're talking to them top of mind, whether it's the environment, antibiotics, and hormones. But we also know consumers are further away from their food than they've ever been. It's probably not a surprise. We asked this in a survey, just thinking about how cattle are raised for food. How familiar are you? 27% of them tell us that they're familiar. So 73% are willingly admitting that they have no idea what the process is about how animals are raised or how cattle are raised for food. And we see this dynamic for poultry and pork as well. And it just tells us there's that opportunity to educate on those things. Like, how can we talk about things like the environment and antibiotics and so on if consumers really don't even know how cattle are raised? And the other thing is that number's probably really inflated. I doubt a quarter of the people actually know what the actual process is about how cattle are raised. Again, this was from a survey. We're not actually testing them or giving scenarios on what the right and wrong one is. But we do know it's of interest. Going back to that consideration slide, you saw those considerations grow. We asked people how much they considered wanting to know more about how their food was raised and grown, and 44% are saying often and always. They want to think about that, they're thinking about those things. Another 26% saying that they sometimes think about those things when they're making meal choices. So it is there. Another dynamic we have seen, this is not, it is more of an at-home dynamic, but it exists still when people are going out to eat. So we see those numbers for consideration drop by about 10% when we look at the production ideas, but they still have grown since that time. One of the questions we did, we went out and did some research to really quantify what we were hearing on animal welfare. And one of the beliefs that we heard come through is we gave them this scenario, one of 4 scenarios. Is which one do you believe to be most true about the beef industry? One, that they live in confinement inside their entire life, confinement outside their entire life. One, which represents the more typical life cycle of cattle going out into pastures for the beginning portions of their life, really the first 2/3 of their life, and then they would finish in a more of a feed yard area. And then the fourth being only a grass-fed operation. 43% of people said that most cattle that they felt like lived in confinement their entire lives. For us, when we look at that as the Beef Checkoff and as NCBA, we see that as an opportunity because there's over 800,000 family farms out there that raise cattle on pastures before they get into a more confined feed yard conditions, but also even at the feed yard capacities, just educating consumers on the oversight and really the room they actually still have to move and a lot of those variables that might be out there. So this is something that we're constantly looking at to be part of our educational resources at the Beef Checkoff. But what we heard from consumers is really 2 camps that they believe existed. One is what they believe is happening currently, the current state of the food production, the large scale, focused on money, mass produced operations that there. This is where the belief from consumers is coming on overcrowded conditions, inhumane treatment, overuse of antibiotics, even impacts on the environment I'd throw in there. And on the right, you see there is still that belief that there are these small family farms. There is that hype that they believe that's where the quality beef is coming from. They think this is more of a dying breed in the industry, and they associate it more with your grass-fed, your organic, your natural type of operations. Now, again, going back to what we believe to be true and what's representative of our industry is really, whether it's our beef quality assurance program, which we'll talk to you about, and a variety of other things that most, if not every farm and ranch out there is doing things the right way, is raising cattle in this way. So it gives us an opportunity to tell our story and educate consumers that are further away from their food than they've ever been. Another topic that came up is what resources do consumers trust? And I think one thing over the last few years that we've seen is there's been a bit of this shift that would be more maybe non-traditional resources or resources that are further away from the food supply or how it's raised anyway, such as grocery stores and butchers and restaurants like chefs and restaurant operators, and consumers going directly to those sources to get this information. We have programs here that we try to work with a variety of different resources because we know that that's where consumers are going to get some of that, as well as online, of course, whether it's bloggers, chefs, a variety of influencer type of engagements, they're going there. And then the farmers and ranchers. We know anytime we hear a farm or ranch story that is seen very positively in the light of consumers, again, going back, there's a lot of them that don't believe that there's that many out there. And really there's hundreds and thousands just in the beef industry out there. And then not trust as much. I wouldn't say that consumers do not trust these entities like USDA and the FDA and big corporations. We actually see when we have more technical topics that they want that sourcing. They want to know there's some third party behind a lot of these statistics and those type of things to show the improvement we're making. But there is some hesitancy on believing them or wanting to do their own research and understanding some of that, and big corporations as well being one of those things. So in fall of 2019, we did a series of research, but we wanted to go out and understand a program that we have here at NCBA called Beef Quality Assurance. And really what this program is an educational program for producers on safety handling and how to better produce quality beef through the safety programs, humane practices, sustainability efforts, and so on. So we wanted to understand the potential with consumers so they can continue to feel good about beef that they were eating, to see if this Beef Quality Assurance Program, or BQA, had any weight or merit with consumers. And what we found is overwhelmingly it did. So when we introduced just what the program was and what it represented, and then some facts about the program, we saw an increase in confidence that the beef consumers were eating that they thought was safe, that the animals were treated humanely, and something that we're always looking to over on the far right, that it represented beef that they could find at their local grocery store. Something we're trying to do, we represent the industry, so we want to make sure people feel good about all beef that's out there, not just that one farmer ranch. And that's something that we're always thinking through, is how do we make that more representative to make people understand, or help people understand, that that the majority, and again, almost every farm and ranch out there is doing things the right way in raising humanely safe beef for consumers. We also, when we launched this program in fall of 2019, it was now, we go back to our consumer beef tracker that I mentioned. We have a lot of attributes that we track in there, being, produced environmentally friendly, raised responsibly. We had 10 or 12 that focus on really what this campaign was. And each one of them saw a significant statistical increase while we were high in market with this campaign. So just showing the impact that this campaign has with consumers. Something we're continuing to evolve. Obviously, there's a lot of talk on the sustainability front, whether that's environmental and things going on. So we've actually recently launched, kind of soft launched and launched a program and campaign this spring, and we're going to be continuing those efforts throughout this year. And it's really going to become a staple at NCBA on behalf of the Checkoff of talking about sustainability. We're looking through some award programs and things along those lines to do case studies, but we've done, or in the midst of doing, a lot of different research to understand what consumers are thinking about this and what content might resonate most with consumers. Interestingly, we took a very similar approach that we've taken before, where we start with focus groups and then try to validate that conversation and then go and do some content testing. So what we wanted to do is get people who say that they have a big focus on sustainability. So we recruited some groups that were highly knowledgeable about sustainability and said they research the topic a lot and it impacts their food decisions. And then a moderate group as well, just to understand what those nuances were. One of the first things that we understood or took away from these groups is that consumers, it was hard for them to talk about the topic outside of the word of sustainability. So when we were trying to tie it to food and try to get a detailed conversation of where some of these perceptions were coming from or what they're doing that impacted, a lot of them kind of backed up and said, I'm not doing a lot directly in my life for sustainability on my food choice. Yes, there is a small percentage of consumers that are doing that more of that high sustainability group that is doing that a little bit more so, but still they weren't doing it as dramatically or as much as you might think by hearing things in the media or hearing things, just reading about topics and sustainability. So top of mind where consumers' heads went in the focus groups when we just talked about the word sustainability before we started probing them at all was really those high level, like lasting came up a lot, recycling, pollution, how can we make, I want, the better for our generations and my children as we grow older. There were some that mentioned plant-based or reducing their meat intake, but we didn't see that overtake the conversation. I believe it was about 4 or 5 out of the 26 people even mentioned that at that high level when we talked about that. And again, a lot of the moderate groups seemed more into it based on convenience. They weren't going to do things that dramatically impacted their life, But if it was something like, yeah, I'll buy a water bottle so I won't use as many single-use plastics, I'm definitely on board with doing that. But am I going to ride my bike to work every day so I'm not driving my car to work to reduce emissions? No, I'm not going to take it to that level. So we also did a quantified, just to understand this, and had consumers type in answers on how they would define sustainability. So the last slide was more of that robust conversation we had with a select few consumers. This was more a survey that we did with over almost 2,000 consumers to understand what was going on. And the biggest thing that came up, and you see the word sustain, but it's all those things that it represents. Again, going back to what we just saw in recycle and that. So you saw a lot of those type of things coming up, making sure it lasts, preserving the earth. Those type of things are the first thing people's head goes to. Then you see environment. With 28% of people mentioning the environment. And a lot of that was general. I just, making sure that we're taking care of the environment. Then you see things that represent social and economic type of, is where you start to see a drop off. And really 3% specifically mentioning food and what they can do with food waste or keeping the food supply up, or that growing population was mentioned. And again, this is at that high level. Now, when we started getting into it more, and we talked about the beef specifically, again, the first thing that we noticed is it was hard for them. So top of mind, they actually didn't come up with much of anything in most of our groups, and most people within the groups. We had to aid them with different topics and then say, well, how do you feel about this? And how do you feel about that? And the biggest thing that came up was animal treatment by far. And you'll see that in some of our quantifiable data as well that we validated with as well. And then we did hear things like emissions come up a little bit, generally just about cattle production, what they're being fed, and honestly, prices and affordability came up. Well, if you do have more regulation, how does that impact prices? Why are prices going up? Why are they, how do we keep this affordable, thinking about that? And there's different levels of awareness going into a lot of these things. So again, quantifying that, when we ask people to define what they thought of with sustainability when it comes to raising cattle for food, the first thing that we see is animal welfare coming up, with about 30% of people talking about that, how are they raised, what are they fed, what are those practices. We continue to see that through a lot of our research. Consumers are looking for that reassurance that the animal is being taken care of. Then we do hit the environment. And there's a variety there. There's a lot of people just generally talking about it. When you get into land and methane use and waste and water, you see it's pretty scattered. People don't go there as much top of mind. And then you do get still some people just talking about making sure we have enough beef and lasting and that type of thing. And then our economic and social aspects of where we start to see some of that drop off here. And then you even have a quarter of people not even really giving us any information, just saying, I really don't know. And they're not even trying. And that goes back to that conversation in the focus groups, that we still saw that struggle even when we recruited people who claimed to be really knowledgeable about this topic. And then lastly, when we asked people about the importance of topics that they wanted for the industry to be addressing when they think about beef and sustainability, we had them select their top 3. The biggest things that you see come up, again, is animal welfare, and then a beef affordability, making sure that beef is affordable in the future so that we can sustain eating it and those type of things. And then all of these environmental ideas and attitudes like climate change, water use, land conservation, greenhouse gases, you see them all really there in teal, was that kind of middle of the road. It was there wasn't a lot of variance. It was pretty scattered, and definitely that second or even tertiary tier. And then some of that, the impact and understanding, is the way we define sustainability is 3 core pillars, whether it's the environment, the animal welfare, and social components that go into that, as well as the economic components that you see with job creation and the contributions to the economy, the outreach and support within a community, and those type of things that the industry provides. And those things, aren't as top of mind. I think they need more examples of that. And again, they didn't have a lot of context with these things. So upcycling is one of those topics that we as an industry do feel has a lot of merit in understanding the cattle digestion and how unique it is, because they're able to digest inedible plants to humans. So like pulp from almonds and things, brewers, the waste from brewing beer and those type of things. The body is unique for cattle to be able to digest those things. So we're able to talk about that. And when we explain that further to consumers, that message actually resonates really strongly with them. But at a high level, topic wise, you can see animal welfare continues to be that thing that we are heroing. So when we're looking at messaging, and something we're trying to keep in mind, again, through our focus groups and what we've seen through this data, is really having this playbook to be clear and concise with consumers. There are a small group of consumers that really want that level of detail, but providing them almost a trail, like a high level message, because for most people that information is enough. For others, they're going to want to go to our website or additional websites to seek out more information, or for a small minority of them. And we want to give them that opportunity. We want to give them the transparency they need, the action they need. And we want to humanize the industry, to continue to hero our farmers and ranchers, to tell their stories. And we have seen that resonate that well. So we're looking at a lot of those programs to see how we can hero that going forward. And really another thing that came up, and it's really more of a reminder for us at NCBA and the checkoff as we're communicating a lot of these things, is really not getting overly technical. We lose consumers a lot when we start to use industry jargon. So just thinking through some of these things, like upcycling that I just mentioned, and how can we communicate that to consumers as a benefit for our industry? And how can we talk about some of these more technical topics that have a lot of science behind them and a lot of rigor, but making them easy to understand and making something that's engaging to consumers. So that's always something that we're looking for and to understand. And then just as one quick reminder, I know that the link is being sent out, but the handout on the state of consumer, which has a lot, especially on that upfront that we talked about, and we're continuing to monitor, and we'll have another release sometime this year of an updated report on this that you'll be able to find on beefresearch.org under the market research section. So with that, I think we have some time to open it up to some questions. If you have any questions, and you could put that in the Q&A, Brooke and I would be happy to answer a few of those for us. It looks like we are having one question come in here. The rise of plant-forward movement across our industry, where do you see the future of beef? Now that's a pretty big question. I think it's one I think we're constantly monitoring. I would say that it's definitely a lot of movement in that. But when we look at it, and we actually do look at, we work with NPD, we also work with Nielsen on actual sales data, and try to aggregate that forward. And what we're seeing, that still represents under 1% of volume if you were to put all substitutes for beef in the beef category and all substitutes for meat in the meat category. So there has been a lot of traction, especially with recent brands making different announcements, different promotions over the last year or two. So it's definitely there. But we're focused on really putting our product forward, and we're really talking about that taste and the value message that we can get out there, even that health forward message, because there's a variety of lean beef cuts out there, and just reinforcing the farmers and ranchers story, and really, where we can, getting into some of these technical topics like the environment, and letting them know what cattle are actually doing out there.
And I'd add to that too, and just knowing that a lot of consumers who are being, targeted with, different plant-based options are kind of those flexitarians. So many of them are still eating animal proteins, and in particular beef as well.
Yeah, I see another one coming in that really gets at, reading about methane being a serious problem in the beef industry. And that's one I'm not the sustainability research expert on our team. We do have some PhDs that focus on that. I would encourage you to go to beefitswhatsfordinner.com, beefresearch.org. We actually have a whole sustainability section. I don't think when you look at that data, there a lot of times, again, I don't want to misspeak, they're comparing some of those numbers to the global instead of the US dynamic that we're seeing. And from my understanding on that topic, it is very low portion of what the greenhouse gas emissions are compared to the automotive industry, compared to a lot of other industries. So it's actually a smaller scale. It's just the way those numbers sometimes are interpreted. I see another one coming in based on what is the volume of sales projection for organic and all natural beef. And it says as a comparison to sales before 2008. Our data doesn't necessarily go back to 2008. I can tell you, I've had some data back to 2012 on this topic specifically. And around that time, we did see an increase in all of those components like organic, grass-fed, and this is more of a retail component, I would say. We don't have as clear of a view on some of the food service data and how much growth is there. But from the retail perspective, to give you that, it was about 2% of volume in dollars. That has increased. Our volume is closer to 3% as of this last year at the end of 2020. And from a dollar standpoint, it's about 4% of beef sales. So it's there. It has grown a little bit. In 2020, everything grew at the retail sector, but it is not overtaking what we are seeing with, USDA Choice and Prime and consumers really wanting to get at those type of ideas. Can you elaborate on beef shortages in stock? What's being done to prevent future occurrences as they relate to consumer confidence and price increase? Again, I don't want to misspeak on that. It's not necessarily my area to focus on that supply. We do have some secondary resources that we rely on for a lot of that information. But what we know, when that happened, there were some of those packing plant out where we did have some of those opportunities happen back in spring, but really the industry was able to rebound pretty quickly from that, whether it was at first limiting because we had some of the out of stocks, but they were really able to catch up at a real high level. I talked to someone that was on the procurement end on the retail side. They said, if we had numbers 5 to 10% higher than a year before this, it would have been hard for us to keep warehouses stocked, to adjust for it. And we were seeing numbers in the meat department and really across grocery too, but that were 40 to 90% week over week. So hard to plan for those things when it first happened, but they were able to adapt rather quickly for that. Not seeing any more questions that have come in, Jackie. I'm happy to pass it back over to you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much. Very appreciated. And a huge virtual round of applause as we thank Brooke and Sean and Caitlin for being here. It's such an interesting topic and quite an insightful presentation. We appreciate you taking the time to share your culinary insights and your research with the ACF community of culinary professionals today. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Be sure to keep an eye out for an email from the Northeast Beef Promotion Initiative. There will be a post-webinar survey and more. As always, you can head to northeastbeef.org for more local resources. If you're interested in hearing more about desserts, then you can also join us on Thursday, May 17th, where we will have a presentation about pâte à choux and pastry skills led by certified executive pastry chef Natasha Capper from the Piedmont Driving Club. So for more culinary news or to register for our upcoming webinars in this series, please check out our website, wearechefs.com. And on behalf of the ACF National Office, thank you again to the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and Northeast Beef Promotion Initiative for the opportunity. And thank you for joining us today. We'll hope to see you all soon at the ACF National Convention this summer in Orlando.